In the quiet town of Chativa, near Valencia, Spain, the year 1431 brought forth a man whose name would reverberate through history as one of its most infamous figures. Rodrigo Borgia, born to a noble family, found himself standing at the crossroads of ambition and destiny. The dusty roads of his childhood would lead him far beyond his modest origins, into the heart of papal power. Rodrigo's early years were shaped by his family's influence in the Spanish court, particularly his uncle, Alfonso de Borja. In 1455, Alfonso's elevation to the papacy as Pope Calixtus III placed young Rodrigo in the perfect position to carve out his own path within the ecclesiastical world. As a man of ambition, Rodrigo wasted no time securing his future. At the tender age of 25, he was appointed cardinal deacon, a position secured not by divine calling or spiritual devotion, but by the well-established practice of nepotism. The Catholic Church, much like the rest of Renaissance Italy, was a landscape where bloodlines and influence often held more sway than piety. Rome, during the late 15th century, was a city of stark contrasts. By day, it echoed with the prayers of pilgrims, and by night, the streets were filled with those who made transactions of far less virtuous nature. Rodrigo, with his sharp mind and unquenchable thirst for power, understood the complexities of this environment. Rome, for him, was not just a holy city, it was a marketplace. His ambition was his currency, and he traded in benefices, securing them with the precision of a master merchant. He was not just a cardinal, he was a Renaissance prince, leading a life of luxury that belied his clerical status. Lavish banquets, sumptuous palaces, and numerous mistresses were the hallmarks of his existence. It was during these years that Rodrigo began to build his family, forging political alliances through relationships with powerful women, none more significant than Venozia Catanei, a Roman noblewoman. From 1474 to 1482, Venozia bore Rodrigo 4 children: Juan, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Giuffre. Each child, a piece on the chessboard of his grand designs. Their futures would be shaped not by love or paternal affection, but by the overwhelming ambition of their father, Rodrigo, whose every move seemed calculated to ensure his family's place at the top of Rome's social and political hierarchy. The Borgias were beginning their rise to power, but it would be their ability to manipulate the church itself that would make their names synonymous with corruption and scandal. Rodrigo Borgia's behavior, even as a cardinal, caused ripples of outrage throughout Rome. His lifestyle was notorious, and his reputation as a man of excess was well known. In 1460, Pope Pius II penned a letter condemning Rodrigo's conduct in Siena, where his actions had shocked the city's court. But for Rodrigo, shame was a luxury he could not afford. His goal was not holiness, but a papacy. To reach that goal, he would have to sacrifice whatever moral reservations others might hold. The next step in his rise came in 1492, when Rodrigo's time would come. The conclave to elect a new pope, held in the Sistine Chapel, was an event shrouded in secrecy and intrigue. The papal election was not solely a spiritual matter, it was a political one. As 23 cardinals gathered to decide the next vicar of Christ, gold flowed as freely as water, and promises were whispered behind closed doors. It was a game of patronage and manipulation, a game Rodrigo had been playing his entire life. And on the 11th of August, 1492, as the smoke of the conclave rose, it was Rodrigo Borgia who emerged as Pope Alexander VI. His victory marked not by divine inspiration, but by the weight of money and alliances. The people of Rome greeted his election with mixed emotions. Alexander was a known figure in the city, and his papacy promised a mix of energy, magnificence, and, most importantly, power. The coronation of Pope Alexander VI on the 26th of August was a grand spectacle, with bonfires illuminating the 7 hills and celebrations sweeping through the street. The Romans, accustomed to the excesses of their cardinals, embraced their new pope with open arms. It seemed that Rome's future would be as grand as its past. With open arms. It seemed that Rome's future would be as grand as its past. The story of Rodrigo Borgia's ascent to the papacy is not one of divine calling, but rather one of calculated manipulation, ruthless ambition, and the strategic wielding of power. Even as a cardinal, Rodrigo's reputation in Rome was already one of scandal and intrigue. His connection to the Borgia family and their ties to the Spanish court gave him significant leverage, but it was his ability to navigate the treacherous waters of papal politics that would prove to be his greatest asset. In the late 15th century, Rome was a city on the brink of transformation. The Renaissance was in full swing, and with it came a renewed focus on secular power, wealth, and influence. The Church, for all its spiritual authority, was no stranger to this new world. The papacy had become more than just a religious office, it was a political throne, and its occupant wielded power far beyond the confines of the Vatican. The papacy had become, for all intents and purposes, a crown to be fought over, and Rodrigo Borgia understood this better than anyone. As a cardinal, Rodrigo's wealth and influence grew steadily. He didn't just acquire benefices, he accumulated them. It was as though he were building a vast network of political connections, each benefice serving as a thread that tied him to powerful figures throughout Europe. Rome itself had become a marketplace where everything, including the sacred, had a price. The sale of ecclesiastical offices, known as simony, was not just an open secret, but a thriving business. Rodrigo, ever the shrewd player, understood that to rise in the church, one needed not only piety but wealth, influence, and the ability to play the game. When his uncle, Pope Calixtus III, ascended to the papacy in 1455, Rodrigo's fate was sealed. He had already been positioned as a player in the church's power struggles, and with Calixtus's influence, Rodrigo's career was set on an irreversible path toward the highest echelons of power. By 1471, when he was appointed as a cardinal deacon, Rodrigo had already begun building his reputation as a man who would stop at nothing to secure his place. His appointment was not a result of spiritual devotion, but of family connections and political maneuvering, which was not unusual in the politically charged environment of the time. It wasn't long before Rodrigo's lavish lifestyle became notorious. His tastes were extravagant, his wealth seemingly endless. He maintained a string of mistresses, each a link in the chain of alliances he was forging. One of the most notable was Vanozza Catane, a Roman noblewoman who bore him 4 children, Juan, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Giuffra, each of whom would play a significant role in his ambitious designs for the Borgia family. These children were not mere offspring, they were pawns in a grand game, each one destined to climb the ranks of power, whether in the church or in the political world. Rodrigo's early life in Rome was characterized by excess and scandal. Despite his clerical position, he was a man who reveled in the luxuries of the Renaissance. Banquets, sumptuous feasts, and private entertainments were his norm. This behavior, however, was not just a reflection of his personal desires. It was a conscious decision to align himself with the powerful figures of the time, royals, cardinals, and noble families, all of whom shared his ambition for power and wealth. This web of alliances would become the foundation upon which Rodrigo would build his papacy. Rodrigo's scandalous behavior did not go unnoticed. In 1460, Pope Pius II wrote a scathing letter criticizing Rodrigo for his conduct in Siena, a town where he had caused a stir with his lavish lifestyle and disregard for ecclesiastical decorum. Such criticism, however, did not faze Rodrigo. He knew that the only way to gain power was to play the game, and he played it with the precision of a seasoned politician. He understood that the papacy was not about spiritual devotion, it was about power, and he was determined to seize it. The conclave of 1492 marked the culmination of Rodrigo's long and strategic rise to power. Behind the closed doors of the Sistine Chapel, a political drama unfolded. The 23 cardinals, including Rodrigo, had gathered to elect the next pope. It was not a spiritual matter, but a political one. Gold changed hands, promises were made, and allegiances were formed. Rodrigo's supporters, including his family and a network of Italian and Spanish cardinals, worked tirelessly to secure his election. It was a game of intrigue, and Rodrigo was a master of it. When the smoke finally cleared on the 11th of August, 1492, Rodrigo Borgia was declared Pope Alexander VI. His election was a triumph of political maneuvering, one that would shape the course of papal history for years to come. But Alexander VI's papacy would not be defined by his piety or spiritual leadership. Instead, it would be marked by the relentless pursuit of power for himself and his family. He was not the first pope to use the papacy for personal gain, but he would become one of the most infamous. The celebration that followed his election was grand, as expected. The people of Rome, accustomed to the extravagance of their cardinals, greeted their new pope with enthusiasm. Bonfires illuminated the 7 hills, and torchlit processions filled the streets. For a brief moment, it seemed that Alexander VI's papacy would usher in an era of grandeur and glory, but as history would soon reveal, the shadow of scandal would follow him wherever he went. Pope Alexander VI's papacy was marked by excess, ambition, and a blatant disregard for the spiritual ideals that were supposed to guide the Catholic Church. But beneath the grandeur of the Vatican's walls, a darker reality began to take shape. Rome, a city that once stood as the heart of Christendom, had become a place where sacred rites and secular indulgences intertwined. By day, The faithful flocked to St. Peter's Basilica, praying in awe of the divine. By night, the same city streets transformed into a playground for the elite, where power, wealth, and corruption flowed as freely as wine. Under Alexander VI, the papacy was no longer seen as a spiritual institution, but as a political and dynastic tool. The Borgia family, with Rodrigo at its helm, became the embodiment of this transformation. While outwardly professing piety and upholding the duties of the church, Alexander VI's actions betrayed a far more ambitious and less holy agenda. His primary concern was not the salvation of souls, but the securing of power for himself and his children. The Vatican, once the sanctuary of faith, now served as a stage for the performance of earthly power. The contrast between the sacred and the profane within the papal court could not have been more stark. The very rooms that hosted holy ceremonies and solemn masses also witnessed unspeakable acts of indulgence. This duality was the hallmark of Alexander's reign. Lavish banquets, attended by cardinals, nobles, and courtesans, were held in the papal apartments, where the line between spiritual reverence and carnal pleasure was blurred beyond recognition. Alexander's own behavior was a reflection of this contradiction. Despite his high office, he indulged in excesses that were not only unbecoming of a pope, but were also scandalous to the point of defying the expectations of even the most morally lax contemporaries. The papal court was a place where virtue had little value, and loyalty was bought and sold like any other commodity. With his vast wealth and influence, Alexander was able to secure the loyalty of those who would be useful to him, including cardinals, diplomats, and military leaders. They, in turn, would receive rewards in the form of ecclesiastical benefices, land, and power. For the Borgia family, this system worked perfectly. As a result, the Borgias were able to place their own members into positions of great power and influence. Cesare Borgia, Alexander's son, was appointed to high ecclesiastical offices at a young age, and his political rise became central to his father's ambitions. The young cardinal was soon entrusted with the papacy's military and political affairs, a role for which he would prove to be both ruthless and effective. But it wasn't just power that Alexander VI sought, it was wealth. The papal coffers, drained by the extravagance of the court, needed replenishment. Alexander found creative ways to fund his ambitious plans, including the sale of indulgences and ecclesiastical offices. These acts, while not unique to him, became a hallmark of his papacy. Through simony, the buying and selling of church positions, Alexander filled the ranks of the College of Cardinals with his supporters, solidifying his grip on power. This practice, though widely known, shocked even the most jaded observers, as the papacy had long been viewed as a sacred office, not a commodity to be traded for personal gain. The moral decay within the Vatican had far-reaching consequences. The very people entrusted with upholding the moral and spiritual integrity of the church were embroiled in a system of corruption that undermined the faith of the people. And yet, despite the growing outrage both within Rome and across Europe, Alexander VI remained resolute in his pursuit of power. He knew that as long as he controlled the papacy, the heart of Christendom, he could weather any storm. However, this balance of sacred and profane could not be maintained indefinitely. The contradictions that defined Alexander VI's reign began to take their toll. While he lavished attention on his family, elevating his children to positions of power and privilege, Rome became increasingly unsettled. Discontent was brewing among the common people, who had grown weary of the constant scandals and excesses of the papal court. At the same time, critics from across Europe began to vocalize their dissatisfaction, pointing to the moral bankruptcy of the papacy as evidence of the church's decline. Even as Alexander VI and his family thrived, the seeds of a much larger crisis were being sown. In the years that followed, these contradictions would become impossible to ignore. The church's failure to rein in the excesses of its leaders, coupled with the ever-increasing influence of secular rulers like Cesare Borgia, would lead to a series of events that would change the course of history. Reformers like Martin Luther would later seize upon the moral failings of the papacy, using them as a rallying cry for change. And though Alexander's reign seemed invincible at the time, the events unfolding within the Vatican would soon spark the flames of the Protestant Reformation, forever altering the religious and political landscape of Europe. As Alexander VI settled into his role, surrounded by a court that indulged in every earthly pleasure, it became clear that the papacy had become a symbol not of divine authority, but of worldly corruption. Rome, once the center of the Christian world, had become a place where the sacred and the profane were inextricably linked, each feeding off the other in a cycle of excess and moral decay. But for the Borgias, this decadence was a means to an end. Their ultimate goal was not just power, but the creation of a dynasty that would rule not only Rome but all of Italy. And it was in this environment where the sacred and the profane intertwined that the most infamous event of Alexander VI's papacy would soon unfold, one that would bring his family's corruption into the full light of history. The year 1492 was a turning point not only for the Borgia family but for the entire Catholic Church. The papal conclave of August 1492 was a political spectacle, a game of alliances, backroom deals, and promises of power. The Church, far from being a purely spiritual institution, had become deeply intertwined with the secular politics of Renaissance Italy, where the influence of money and family ties dictated the course of events. And it was in this environment that Rodrigo Borgia's dream finally came true. After years of maneuvering, financial scheming, and leveraging his family connections, Rodrigo was elected Pope Alexander VI on the 11th of August, 1492. The coronation was a grand affair, attended by all of Rome's high society. Bonfires illuminated the streets, and celebratory processions wound through the ancient city. The people of Rome, despite knowing of Rodrigo's dubious reputation, embraced their new pope with enthusiasm. He was no stranger to them. He had been a cardinal for many years, known for his opulence, his lavish lifestyle, and his ability to navigate the intricate web of Roman politics. They were accustomed to his presence, and his election seemed almost inevitable. The Borgia family had long been fixtures in the papal court, and now they had ascended to the pinnacle of power. But Alexander VI's papacy was destined to be anything but conventional. His election was secured, not by divine intervention, but by the corrupt practices that had come to define the papal system. The election of Alexander VI was marred by accusations of simony, the buying and selling of ecclesiastical offices, a practice that had been widespread but had never before been so openly acknowledged. Alexander's supporters, many of whom were cardinals indebted to him for their positions, ensured that he would be the next pope, despite the moral outrage it caused across Europe. For a brief moment after his election, Alexander VI seemed poised to bring a new era of governance to the papacy. He was praised for his intelligence and his apparent dedication to reforming the chaotic streets of Rome. The city had long been plagued by lawlessness, and Alexander took swift action to restore order. He imposed a new system of magistrates to maintain peace, and he personally presided over judicial hearings, winning accolades for his efficiency and impartiality. His reforms, though brief, were seen as signs of a pope who might have the potential to restore the Church's moral authority. But this initial wave of reform was short-lived. As with so many of Alexander's other initiatives, it quickly became overshadowed by his overwhelming desire to advance the interests of his family. The focus of his papacy shifted from religious governance to the securing of power and wealth for his children. It was a transformation that would define his reign and would soon plunge Rome into scandal and depravity. Alexander VI's papacy marked the beginning of a new era for the Borgia family, a period of unparalleled ambition. His children, particularly his sons Juan and Cesare, were elevated to positions of power that many deemed outrageous. Cesare Borgia, a man of rare ambition, was appointed Archbishop of Valencia at the age of 18. Later, he would become a cardinal, despite his lack of interest in the spiritual duties that such a position entailed. Cesare, who had initially entered the clergy at his father's behest, soon abandoned his ecclesiastical duties in favor of military and political ambitions. This marked the beginning of his meteoric rise as a secular power, one who would use warfare and manipulation to carve out a kingdom for himself in Italy. The Borgia family's political machinations were not limited to ecclesiastical appointments. They sought to expand their influence throughout Italy, forging alliances with powerful rulers and military leaders. Alexander VI's actions were calculated to further these ambitions. He married off his daughter Lucrezia to various noblemen to strengthen his family's ties with powerful Italian families. Each of these marriages was more of a political maneuver than a union of love, and they were a testament to the Borgia family's ability to manipulate the Italian aristocracy for their own gain. But while the Borgia family's power grew, so too did their reputation for scandal and corruption. The people of Rome were increasingly aware of the moral decay that had set in under Alexander's reign. The papal court had become a theatre of excess, a place where lavish feasts, political intrigues, and debauched entertainments were the order of the day. Alexander's mistresses, such as the notorious Julia Farnese, freely roamed the Vatican, adding to the scandal that already surrounded the Borgia name. It became clear that Alexander's papacy was about more than religious leadership. It was about creating a legacy of power for the Borgias, regardless of the cost. As Alexander VI's papacy continued, the Borgia family's actions grew ever more audacious. Cesare, in particular, was determined to carve out a secular empire of his own. His rise to power would be marked by violence, betrayal, and political manipulation. But for all of Alexander VI's wealth and influence, his reign was ultimately a time of moral and spiritual decay for the Church. The sacred and the profane had become so intertwined that they could no longer be distinguished, and it was in this environment of corruption and indulgence that the most notorious scandal of the Borgia papacy would soon unfold. With Alexander VI firmly established as Pope, the Borgia family's influence spread rapidly through the Italian peninsula. The papacy, which had once been a spiritual institution, had now become the centerpiece of a powerful dynasty. With Alexander at the helm and his children, their futures tightly bound to their father's ambitions at the forefront, the Borgia family's meteoric rise from relative obscurity to the most powerful political force in Renaissance Italy was not driven by piety or devotion, but by cunning, ruthlessness, and a tireless pursuit of wealth and power. At the heart of this ambitious family were Alexander's children, Cesare, Juan, Lucrezia, and Geoffrey. Each one had been carefully positioned in the grand strategy of their father's papacy. Cesare, the most ambitious and intelligent of Alexander's sons, was perhaps the most intriguing. Initially destined for a career in the church, Cesare's talents lay in politics and military strategy, not in spiritual matters. At just 18 years old, he was appointed Archbishop of Valencia, and soon after, he became a cardinal despite showing little interest in the ecclesiastical duties that came with the position. Cesare, however, was a man of action, and by the time he reached his 20s, he had discarded his clerical titles and turned his sights on creating a secular empire for himself. Alexander's other son, Juan, was the eldest of the Borgia children, but his character was less suited to the political machinations of his father. Juan, who had been made Duke of Gandia, was known for his excesses driven by greed and selfish indulgence. His incompetence as a military leader and his cruelty toward his subjects only added to the growing resentment against him. Though he was his father's firstborn, his failures would soon make him a liability rather than an asset. As the political landscape shifted, so too did the fate of the Borgia children. Meanwhile, Lucrezia, the Borgia daughter, played an equally important role in the family's strategy. Her marriages, arranged by her father, were nothing more than political tools, meant to further the family's influence across Italy. Her first marriage to Giovanni Sforza, a nobleman from Milan, was annulled under mysterious circumstances, and she was quickly married off to Alfonso of Aragon. However, this marriage, too, would end in tragedy when Alfonso was murdered, possibly at the hands of Cesare, who feared that the marriage had become an obstacle to his political ambitions. Lucrezia, though often portrayed as a victim of her family's ambitions, was not merely a pawn in her father's schemes. She played her role with a quiet strength, navigating the treacherous waters of the Borgia family's machinations. The Borgia family's ambitions went far beyond the Vatican. Cesare Borgia, having abandoned the church, embarked on a series of military campaigns across Italy, forging alliances with foreign powers, including France, and employing both diplomacy and violence to expand his family's territory. His conquest of the Romagna, a region in central Italy, was particularly notable. By using military force, political manipulation, and assassination, Cesare carved out a domain that made him one of the most powerful men in Italy. His success was so great that the political theorist Niccolò Machiavelli would later use Cesare as the model for his book The Prince, admiring Cesare's ability to wield cruelty and cunning to achieve his goals. The Borgia family's rise to power was not without its cost. The political atmosphere in Rome became increasingly unstable as rival factions vied for control. The Borgia family's aggressive pursuit of power led to a growing sense of fear and resentment among the other noble families of Rome and Italy. Their manipulation of the papacy, the strategic marriages, the ruthless tactics in the battlefield, all of these actions created an environment of distrust and suspicion. At the same time, the excesses of the papal court under Alexander VI became legendary. The Vatican, once the spiritual center of Christendom, had transformed into a decadent playground for the Borgia family. Banquets were held late into the night, accompanied by music, dancing, and courtesans, with guests ranging from cardinals to ambassadors to wealthy merchants. The line between spiritual authority and secular indulgence was so blurred that it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. Alexander VI, ever the political operator, used these events not only for personal pleasure, but as a means of solidifying his power. The guests who attended these entertainments, many of whom were cardinals and members of the papal court, were implicitly complicit in the corruption that permeated the Vatican. Even the spiritual duties of the papacy seemed secondary to Alexander VI's primary mission, securing his family's future. The church, in his eyes, was not a moral institution to be revered, but a tool to be wielded. This relentless pursuit of power, wealth, and influence would come to define his papacy and would eventually bring scandal and ruin to the Borgia family. It was not only the nobles and diplomats who were aware of the Borgias' growing power and influence. The common people of Rome, though often subject to the whims of their rulers, began to grow disillusioned with the papacy's moral decay. The scandals surrounding Alexander VI and his family were impossible to ignore, and though they continued to celebrate the power and grandeur of the papacy, whispers of corruption and immorality spread throughout the city. The Borgia family's ambitions were not simply confined to Rome. As their influence spread across Italy, their actions began to draw the attention of foreign powers. The Kingdom of France, for example, recognized the value of allying with Cesare Borgia and sought to use him as a means of controlling the Papal States. But these alliances were fragile and often subject to the changing tides of Italian politics. Cesare's rise to power and his growing influence in the papacy was a source of both admiration and fear among Italy's other rulers. The ambitious Borgia family had made powerful enemies, and their hold on power, though seemingly unassailable, was increasingly precarious. At the same time, the spectre of reform hung over the Catholic Church. Critics of the papacy, both within and outside of Rome, began to call for change. The excesses of Alexander VI and the corruption that surrounded him were seen as clear evidence of the Church's decline. Calls for reform became louder, and reformers like Martin Luther would later seize upon these scandals as proof of the moral failings of the papacy. Yet, despite the growing criticism, Alexander VI and his family continued their pursuit of power with little regard for the growing unrest within the church and across Europe. In June of 1497, the city of Rome was rocked by a tragedy that would change the course of the Borgia family's destiny forever. One Borgia, the eldest son of Pope Alexander VI, was found dead, his body floating in the Tiber River. His throat had been slashed, and his body bore 9 distinct wounds. The murder of Juan was a shocking event, one that sent shockwaves through Rome and beyond. It marked the beginning of a dark chapter in the history of the Borgia family, one that would be defined by betrayal, grief, and the collapse of the family's carefully constructed power. The death of Juan was a tragedy that seemed to strike at the very heart of Alexander VI's papacy. For 3 days and nights, the Pope withdrew from public life, mourning the loss of his son in a manner that stunned even his closest advisors. Observers described him as a broken man, weeping in private, a far cry from the powerful and calculating figure that had ascended to the papacy just a few years earlier. In his grief, Alexander VI made an unexpected vow of reform. He promised to address the moral decay within the papal court, to tackle the rampant corruption, and to restore the dignity of the church. For a brief moment, it seemed that the Pope might be ready to atone for the sins of his family's reign. But just as quickly as the promise of reform had come, it faded. Alexander VI's mourning proved to be as temporary as his resolve for change. The death of his son, while deeply painful, was ultimately overshadowed by the political and personal ambitions that had always driven him. As quickly as the Pope announced his intention to curb the excesses of the papacy, those reforms were forgotten. The pursuit of power for his remaining children, especially Cesare, soon took precedence over any promises made in the aftermath of Juan's death. The circumstances surrounding Juan's murder were murky, and suspicion quickly fell upon Cesare Borgia, the Pope's second son. The motivations for the murder are still debated by historians, with some suggesting that it was a political move, orchestrated by Cesare himself to eliminate a rival for power. Juan, though his status as the heir to the papacy had been secure, was a man of little political acumen, prone to indulgence and cruelty. His failures, both as a military leader and as a nobleman, had increasingly made him a liability to the Borgia family. His murder could have been seen as a convenient way to remove him from the equation, clearing the path for Cesare's rise. But the murder was not just a personal tragedy for the Borgia family, it was a political disaster for the Pope. It created instability within the papal court and caused many of Alexander VI's allies to question the family's future. While some observers accepted the official story that Juan had been the victim of a robbery gone wrong, many others were suspicious, especially given the Borgia family's track record of ruthless political maneuvering. The political fallout from Juan's murder was immediate. Foreign ambassadors, who had once been eager to court the papacy's favor, now found themselves questioning whether they could trust the Borgias. The alliances that Alexander had carefully cultivated began to fray. Even within the papal court, there were whispers of distrust and betrayal. The murder of Juan Borgia had exposed the fragility of the family's power and had cast a dark shadow over their future. Despite this, Alexander VI pressed on with his plans for his family. The Pope's grief over Juan's death, though genuine, was not enough to curb his ambitions for Cesare. The murder of Juan may have served as the catalyst for Cesare's ultimate break from the church and his embrace of military and political power. With his elder brother out of the way, Cesare now stood as the rightful heir to the Borgia family's ambitions. Cesare's rise after Juan's death was swift and ruthless. He began to expand his power in central Italy, carving out a domain for himself that stretched from the Papal States to the Romagna. He became known for his military brilliance, his charisma, and his unrelenting pursuit of political dominance. He would employ assassination, manipulation, and warfare to achieve his ends, often with the tacit approval of his father. Alexander VI, in his pursuit of securing a legacy for his family, gave Cesare free rein to pursue his goals, including forging alliances with foreign powers like France to further his expansion. Though Cesare's ambitions were formidable, his reign as the Borgia heir would not go unchallenged. The same ruthlessness that allowed him to succeed also made him a figure of fear and loathing in the eyes of many. His rise to power would lead to a series of brutal confrontations with rival families, as well as with his own allies. But for Alexander VI, Cesare represented the future of the Borgia family and the continuation of their dominance in Italy. Juan Borgia's death, tragic as it was, marked the beginning of the end for the original vision of the Borgia dynasty. While his murder provided Cesare with an opportunity to rise, it also exposed the inherent dangers of a family built on ambition and power. The political stability that had once seemed so secure began to crumble under the weight of its own excesses. But despite the growing tensions and instability, Alexander VI continued to push forward with his plans, focused on securing his family's legacy, no matter the cost. In the wake of Juan's death, the Borgia family's ambition grew ever more insatiable. Their rise to power had come at a great cost, both personal and political, but it would be nothing compared to the scandal and moral decay that was soon to come. And as Alexander VI and Cesare continued their pursuit of dominion, they would soon find themselves confronting a force far more powerful than any they had encountered before reform. The murder of Juan Borgia in 1497 had not only shaken the foundations of the Borgia family, but also threatened to unravel the delicate political and spiritual empire that Pope Alexander VI had carefully constructed. In the immediate aftermath of his son's death, Alexander's grief was profound. Behind closed doors, he wept for the loss of his firstborn, and many in Rome believed that the death of Juan might be the final blow to the Borgia dynasty. But, ever the political operator, Alexander quickly turned his grief into a renewed public commitment to reform. For a brief and fleeting moment, the people of Rome and the cardinals of the church saw hope that Alexander VI might use his papacy for a greater good. The Pope, ever aware of the growing discontent surrounding his reign, promised reforms. He vowed to restore order to the papal court, to address the excesses of his family, and to take meaningful action against corruption. He spoke of eliminating the worst of the simony that had so stained the papacy, of curbing the indulgence of luxury, and of returning the church to its spiritual roots. This period, though short, was seen by many as a last chance for Alexander VI to redeem himself in the eyes of Rome and Christendom. However, as with many of Alexander's promises, the vow of reform proved to be nothing more than a temporary gesture. The Pope's commitment to spiritual and moral renewal lasted only as long as his grief, which soon gave way to his insatiable desire for power. Despite the temporary public embrace of reform, Alexander's focus quickly shifted back to the advancement of his family's interests, primarily those of his remaining son, Cesare. With Juan's death, Cesare had effectively become the sole heir to the Borgia legacy, and Alexander was determined to make sure his ambitious son would continue the family's ascent. Cesare Borgia, though once destined for a career in the church, now turned fully to secular power. His talents as a military strategist and political manipulator had always been apparent, but with his brother out of the way, Cesare's rise to prominence was swift and unrelenting. No longer confined to the robes of a cardinal, Cesare began a campaign to carve out his own territory within Italy, following in the footsteps of other powerful noble families. One of Cesare's most significant early moves came in 1499, when he sought to expand his control over central Italy. His ambition took shape with the conquest of the Romagna, a region held by various small independent towns and cities. Cesare employed a mixture of military might, political alliances, and brutal manipulation to bring the region under his control. His campaigns were marked by a ruthless efficiency. His soldiers, both mercenaries and loyalists, followed him through sieges and bloodshed to accomplish what few thought possible. Cesare was a master of warfare, using tactics that would have made any Renaissance general proud, and he quickly gained recognition as one of the most capable commanders of his time. But Cesare's rise was not without its cost. His ruthless methods earned him many enemies, both in Italy and beyond. While some admired his ambition and cunning, others saw him as a dangerous and unprincipled leader who would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. Despite his military successes, Cesare's political relationships were increasingly strained. He often found himself at odds with other powerful families, including the Orsini and Colonna families, who had their own designs on Rome and the Papal States. Cesare's willingness to use assassination, bribery, and subterfuge to eliminate his enemies earned him a reputation as a man who was willing to sacrifice anyone in his path, including members of his own family. The political turbulence in Italy at this time created a volatile environment. The various city-states and noble families were constantly vying for control of territory, wealth, and influence. Cesare's alliance with the French King Louis XII further complicated the situation. In exchange for military support and legitimacy, Cesare agreed to help Louis achieve his own ambitions in Italy, particularly his desire to conquer the Kingdom of Naples. This alliance, though initially beneficial to both parties, would eventually lead to tensions between the Borgias and the French, as both sides realized they had competing interests in the region. Despite these tensions, Alexander VI continued to support Cesare's military campaigns, pouring papal resources into his son's wars of expansion. The Pope, whose own position was increasingly precarious due to the scandals surrounding his family, relied on Cesare's success to bolster his own power. The idea of a Borgia dynasty, with Cesare as its secular ruler, was tantalizing for Alexander, who believed that through conquest and manipulation, he could create a lasting legacy that would endure long after his papacy ended. But Alexander's involvement in Cesare's campaigns came at a cost. The Pope's support for his son's military ventures drained the papal treasury, and Rome, already a city rife with corruption, began to show signs of economic strain. The lavish banquets, political intrigue, and indulgence that had once characterized Alexander's reign now became increasingly difficult to maintain. The people of Rome, though often complicit in the excesses of the papacy, began to grow restless. The promise of reform, though briefly embraced, had not been realized. Instead, Alexander VI, the papacy, had become more about securing power for his family than about fulfilling the spiritual duties of the church. As Caesar continued his campaigns, his father's reign grew more unstable. Alexander VI's attempts at reform had failed, and the scandals surrounding his family grew more egregious by the day. Yet, despite all of this, Alexander remained unrepentant. His devotion to his children, particularly Cesare, was unwavering, and while reform had been abandoned, the Borgia family's ambitions remained as strong as ever. The political landscape of Italy, though unstable and rife with conflict, would soon bear witness to one of the most infamous events in papal history, the event that would bring the papacy and the Borgia name to its most infamous moment. As the new century dawned, the Borgia family stood at the height of their power, their ambitions as boundless as ever. Cesare, having secured the Romagna, was already positioning himself as the true ruler of central Italy, while Alexander VI's papacy, though marked by corruption and scandal, was yet unshaken by the growing whispers of dissent. But beneath the facade of grandeur, a dangerous indulgence simmered within the papal court. Rome, once the center of spiritual authority, had become a city where the sacred and the profane were no longer distinguishable. It was in this climate of decadence, where excesses and moral decay ran rampant, that the most notorious event of Alexander VI's papacy would unfold, an event that would go down in history as the Banquet of Chestnuts. The banquet took place on the night of the 31st of October, 1501, a date steeped in both pagan and Christian symbolism. All Hallows' Eve, the night when the veil between the living and the dead was said to be thinnest, would serve as the backdrop for an event that would forever stain the reputation of the Catholic Church. The timing of the banquet, whether intentional or not, was perfect. It was a night that traditionally blurred the lines between the sacred and the profane, a night when the boundaries of morality were often tested. Inside the Vatican, preparations for the evening were already underway. Cesare Borgia, always the instigator of the most audacious ideas, had masterminded the event. His aim was not simply to entertain, but to shock and provoke, to demonstrate the Borgia family's dominance over Rome and its institutions, even in the most depraved ways. A guest list was carefully curated, bringing together the highest echelons of Rome's political and ecclesiastical elite. Cardinals, diplomats, and noble families would attend, joining the Pope and his children in what was to be a night of unparalleled hedonism. But the true spectacle was yet to come. The central feature of the evening would be the entertainment. 50 courtesans, handpicked for their beauty, sophistication, and discretion, These women were not the common prostitutes of the streets, but were instead seasoned entertainers, trained in the art of pleasing the powerful while maintaining the necessary veil of propriety. Their task was not just to dance and perform, they were to serve as the very centerpiece of the evening's debauchery. The rooms where the banquet would take place were part of the Borgia apartments in the Vatican, magnificent spaces adorned with frescoes depicting both classical mythology and Christian history. Ironically, these beautifully decorated rooms designed to showcase the wealth and culture of the papacy would soon serve as the stage for a night of degradation that would eclipse even the most decadent excesses of the ancient Roman emperors. As the evening approached, the air inside the Vatican grew thick with anticipation. Servants scurried about, preparing the rooms, setting the tables with extravagant dishes, and ensuring that the wine would flow freely throughout the night. Candles flickered in the dimly lit rooms, casting shadows across the frescoes, creating an atmosphere of eerie, almost surreal decadence. This was to be a night of excess in every sense. A night where the boundaries between religious piety and secular indulgence would be shattered irreparably. Alexander VI, ever the proud patriarch, would host the event, seated in a position of honor alongside his son Cesare and daughter Lucrezia. The presence of Lucrezia at such an event remains one of the most puzzling aspects of the night. Was she a willing participant, as some contemporary accounts suggest, or was she a victim of her father's manipulation, forced to attend a night that went against every ideal of what a daughter of the church should represent? Scholars and historians have long debated this question, but the reality remains that her presence at such a gathering was, in itself, a powerful symbol of the moral decay that had set in at the highest levels of the church. The evening's entertainment began innocently enough with a lavish banquet, featuring delicacies befitting the elite guests who had gathered to witness the spectacle. Wine flowed, and conversation drifted between topics of politics, military campaigns, and art patronage. The mood was one of refinement, at least on the surface. But as the evening wore on, the true nature of the entertainment began to unfold. The courtesans, dressed in the finest silks and velvets, began to dance for their guests, moving gracefully to the music provided by skilled musicians. Their movements, once innocent and poised, gradually became more provocative as the wine continued to flow. And then came the infamous chestnuts. The banquet had been named for this seemingly innocent object, yet its role in the evening's events would prove to be anything but innocent. Chestnuts, placed around the floor, would serve as the focal point of the evening's most scandalous and degrading performance. The courtesans were instructed to crawl on their hands and knees, collecting the chestnuts scattered across the floor, their bodies illuminated by the flickering candlelight. This spectacle, which began as an elegant dance, soon devolved into something much more explicit, as the courtesans discarded their clothes, revealing their naked bodies to the assembled guests. The boundaries of decency had been erased, and the crowd, many of whom were cardinals and men of the church, watched, captivated by the display of shamelessness unfolding before them. The moral implications of the Banquet of Chestnuts were as profound as the spectacle itself. The fact that such a night could unfold within the sacred walls of the Vatican, under the watchful eye of the Pope, was a damning indictment of the Borgia papacy. But it was not just the guests who were complicit in this debauchery. The very presence of Alexander VI and Cesare Borgia at the event, and their active participation in it, symbolized the collapse of the moral authority of the Church. The Pope, the supposed vicar of Christ, was no longer the spiritual leader of the faithful. He was a man of power, seeking only to indulge in the pleasures of the flesh, regardless of the consequences. As the night wore on and the chestnut games reached their climax, the question remained: why had Alexander VI allowed such a spectacle to unfold? Was it a symbol of his family's dominance over Rome? A statement of their unbridled power over both the sacred and the profane? Or was it simply another example of the moral bankruptcy that had consumed the papacy under his rule? Whatever the reason, the Banquet of Chestnuts marked the pinnacle of the Borgia family's corruption, a moment that would go down in history as one of the most scandalous events in the history of the Catholic Church. As the night progressed, the atmosphere in the Vatican's private chambers grew more charged. What had begun as an elegant affair quickly transformed into a spectacle of debauchery that defied even the most debased expectations of Renaissance Rome. The courtesans, once clothed in fine silks, now moved about naked, their bodies illuminated by flickering candlelight. Their sensual dance, which had started as a graceful performance for the entertainment of Rome's elite, had turned into a public display of the most forbidden desires, carefully choreographed to provoke, unsettle, and entertain. At the center of this depravity was the chestnuts, a seemingly innocent food item, but one that had been transformed into a symbol of both submission and indulgence. The women were instructed to crawl across the floor, collecting chestnuts that had been scattered in a carefully designed obstacle course. Their movements slow and deliberate, meant to accentuate their exposed bodies. The guests, many of whom were cardinals, diplomats, and powerful noblemen, watched intently as the women performed, their reactions ranging from amusement to unrestrained lust. As the courtesans moved across the room, each chestnut they gathered became more than just an object of the game. It became an instrument of humiliation. The women's actions, performed under the gaze of Rome's most influential men, symbolized not just physical submission, but a surrender of dignity. What was intended to be a form of high entertainment, enjoyed by the most powerful in Christendom, quickly degenerated into a grotesque parody of the moral and spiritual ideals of the Church. Throughout the night, the boundaries between sacred and profane became further blurred. Guests who had entered the banquet hall as pious men of the cloth, wearing the insignia of their office, soon found themselves embroiled in a spectacle that exposed their deepest moral failings. Some of the cardinals who had sworn vows of celibacy and devoted their lives to the Church now competed with one another in the depravity of the evening. This was no longer a private indulgence, but a public contest, a display of power, wealth, and dominance. Pope Alexander VI, the man who was supposed to be the moral leader of Christendom, sat at the head of the room, watching as the events unfolded. His role in this scandal was as crucial as it was damning. For Alexander, there was no distinction between his role as the vicar of Christ and his role as the patriarch of the Borgia family. As the night grew darker and the exhibition became more explicit, it became clear that his indulgence in worldly pleasures had reached a point of no return. His position as Pope had not afforded him a sense of divine responsibility. Instead, it had allowed him to indulge in the most earthly desires without consequence. The actions of his family, the entertainments in his court, and his willingness to let such a spectacle unfold under his very roof made it impossible to separate the sacred from the profane. Perhaps the most disturbing element of the evening was the presence of Lucrezia Borgia, the Pope's daughter. Her role in the event, as both an observer and a participant, has remained a point of historical debate. Some sources suggest that she was coerced into attending and was unwilling to partake in the lascivious acts of the evening. Others argue that, as a member of the Borgia family, she was complicit in the actions, fully aware of the purpose behind her father's indulgence. Regardless of her involvement, her presence in such a degrading scene spoke volumes about the Borgia family's moral descent. The Vatican, a place once synonymous with spiritual authority, had become a theatre for their political and sexual ambitions. As the night reached its climax, the guests began a grotesque competition. Men who had once held positions of reverence within the Church now found themselves competing for the affections of the courtesans, eager to claim prizes for their sexual prowess. The prizes, tunics, shoes, and silk barrets were luxurious items, each representing the wealth and status that defined the Renaissance elite. The games were not just a display of hedonism, they were a public demonstration of the power dynamics at play within the papal court. These men, who had once preached the virtues of chastity and devotion, now degraded themselves for the sake of worldly rewards. As the event wore on, it became evident that the papacy, under Alexander VI, had lost any semblance of sanctity. The Vatican, once the holiest place in Christendom, was now a stage for indulgence, where the line between spiritual authority and carnal pleasure had been irreversibly erased. For the Borgias, this event was not just an indulgence in the pleasures of the flesh, but an assertion of power. They were sending a message to the people of Rome, to their political allies, and to their enemies. They were untouchable. Their corruption, their excess, and their cruelty were no longer hidden behind closed doors. They were on full display for all to see. The aftermath of the Banquet of Chestnuts was one of shock and disbelief. In Rome, whispers of the event spread like wildfire, first through the lower classes and then to foreign ambassadors and dignitaries who had attended or had heard rumors. The scandal reverberated throughout Europe, and even the most disillusioned observers of the papacy were stunned by the debauchery that had taken place under the roof of St. Peter's. It wasn't just the physical actions of the night that caused outrage, it was the moral and spiritual implications. The Pope, the supposed shepherd of the Catholic Church, had abandoned his spiritual duties and succumbed to the very vices that the Church was supposed to condemn. For some, the Banquet of Chestnuts was the final straw. Calls for reform within the Church, already simmering due to Alexander's many corrupt practices, now became louder and more urgent. Critics of the papacy seized upon the event as evidence that the Church had become irredeemably corrupt, and soon, the call for reform would give rise to the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther, with his 95 Theses, would challenge the very foundations of the Catholic Church, and the Borgia papacy, exemplified by the excesses of Alexander VI, would become a rallying cry for those who believed that the church had lost its way. In the years following the banquet, the Borgia family's hold on power would begin to unravel. Alexander VI's reign would ultimately be seen as the peak of Borgia corruption, a period where the sacred and the profane were so inextricably linked that even the most devout could no longer ignore the moral decay. As the Vatican moved forward into the 16th century, its legacy would be forever marred by the events of that October evening. The night of the Banquet of Chestnuts marked a dramatic point in papal history, but the reverberations of the event would continue to shake the foundations of the church and the Borgia family long after the candles had been extinguished. The immediate aftermath of the banquet was a period of intense moral reckoning, both for the Borgia family and for the wider world that had witnessed their corruption. The public, though often complicit in the excesses of their rulers, could not ignore the enormity of the scandal that had unfolded in the heart of Christendom. The Vatican, the seat of spiritual authority, had been transformed into a theatre of degradation, and the reverberations of that transformation were felt across Europe. In Rome, the rumors and whispers began to spread like wildfire. Servants, guards, and minor officials who had witnessed the events began to share their accounts with others, and within days, the entire city seemed to know of the orgy that had taken place in the papal apartments. The guests, many of whom were cardinals and high-ranking church officials, could not escape the consequences of their participation. Though they remained silent in public, their actions were now a matter of widespread gossip and judgment. Even the most powerful men in Rome were implicated in the scandal, their loyalty to the papacy forever tainted by their indulgence in the depravity that had unfolded within the Vatican walls. News of the banquet spread far beyond Rome, reaching the courts and capitals of Europe. The incident became a symbol of the moral decay of the church, a glaring example of how far the papacy had fallen from its spiritual ideals. In France, Spain, and across Italy, the event was discussed in hushed tones, and it became the subject of derision and shock. Even secular rulers, accustomed to their own excesses, were appalled by the scandal. The contrast between the sacred and the profane was now so stark that it seemed impossible to ignore. The papacy, once a revered institution, was now viewed by many as nothing more than a political and moral sham, led by a family that had abandoned all pretense of divine responsibility. The Banquet of Chestnuts did not just damage the reputation of Pope Alexander VI, it exposed the vulnerability of the entire papal system. The very authority of the church had been compromised. The papacy, once seen as the divinely ordained protector of the faithful, had become a symbol of corruption and indulgence. For many, the event underscored the idea that the church was not a sacred institution but a political machine, driven by the same desires for wealth, power, and control that fueled the secular rulers of Europe. It was this sense of moral bankruptcy that would fuel the growing calls for reform. Among those who were most vocal in their condemnation of the Borgia papacy were reformers and critics from within the church itself. The notorious conduct of the Borgias, coupled with the papacy's increasing entanglement in the political affairs of European rulers, spurred a growing sense of disillusionment. Church leaders began to openly question the legitimacy of a papacy that had so clearly abandoned its spiritual mission. Though the Borgia family had always been controversial, the banquet seemed to crystallize everything that was wrong with the papal system. It was clear to many that change was needed, and soon, in the years following the Banquet of Chestnuts, the Borgia family's influence began to unravel. Alexander VI, despite his continued hold on the papacy, found himself increasingly isolated. Political alliances that had once seemed unbreakable began to fray, and Cesare's military ventures, though successful, began to falter. The spectre of reform loomed larger than ever. Europe's increasing dissatisfaction with the corruption of the Catholic Church would soon give rise to one of the most significant movements in religious history, the Protestant Reformation. The death of Pope Alexander VI in 1503 marked the end of the Borgias' reign over the papacy, though their legacy would continue to haunt the Church for centuries. Alexander's passing was followed by political chaos, with various factions within Rome competing for power. Cesare Borgia, once the heir apparent to the papal throne, found himself without the support he had enjoyed under his father. With no papal backing and his military conquests beginning to crumble, Cesare was forced to retreat, ultimately dying as a mercenary in Spain at the age of 31. Lucrezia, once a political pawn in her father's schemes, would survive to become the Duchess of Ferrara, though her name, like those of her family, would forever be tied to scandal. For Rome and the Vatican, the Banquet of Chestnuts was a turning point. It was a scandal that could not be erased, no matter how much time passed. The very rooms where the event had occurred were left behind as symbols of the moral decay of the papacy. In the years to come, new popes, including Julius II, would seek to distance themselves from the Borgias. Julius II, in fact, famously chose to vacate the Borgia apartments and moved into new quarters, commissioning Raphael to decorate them with frescoes that would become some of the most revered works of the Renaissance. Despite this attempt at rebuilding, the damage to the papacy's reputation could not be undone. The shadow of the Borgia family and the legacy of their indulgences would continue to haunt the Vatican. The Banquet of Chestnuts, a night that had begun as a lavish spectacle of power and depravity, had become a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with the papacy during the Renaissance. It stood as a reminder of how easily even the most sacred institutions could fall prey to human desires, and how those desires could corrupt not just individuals but entire systems of power. The Catholic Church would eventually seek to reform itself in response to the growing tide of Protestantism. The Council of Trent, which would be convened decades later, would address many of the issues that the Borgia papacy had embodied: the abuse of power, the selling of indulgences, and the moral failures of the clergy. But the Church's reforms, though substantial, could not erase the memory of the Borgia scandal, and the papacy would never again enjoy the same unchallenged authority it had once held. In the end, the Banquet of Chestnuts was more than just a scandal. It was the culmination of the Borgia family's unchecked ambition, a moment when the moral foundations of the Church were exposed for all to see. And in that exposure, the Church's relationship with power, authority, and spirituality was irrevocably altered. The Borgias had burned too brightly, too recklessly, and the aftermath of their reign would leave scars on the fabric of the Catholic Church that would never fully heal. The death of Pope Alexander VI in 1503 marked the end of an era for the Borgia family. For a time, it seemed as if the Borgias' control over Rome and the papacy would endure, but in reality, their influence began to crumble almost immediately after Alexander's passing. The events that had unfolded under his reign, the Banquet of Chestnuts, the ruthless ambition of Cesare Borgia, and the moral decay that permeated the papal court, had set the stage for the family's eventual downfall. Upon Alexander VI's death, the papacy faced a volatile succession. There was no clear successor who could command the same power and authority as the late pope. The political alliances that Alexander had forged, particularly his relationships with powerful families and foreign rulers, quickly began to fray. The Borgia family's enemies, who had long been waiting for an opportunity to strike, seized the moment. Cesare, once the most powerful of the Borgia children, now found himself vulnerable without the protection of his father's papal support. His military endeavors faltered, and his once unassailable power in central Italy began to diminish. The immediate aftermath of Alexander's death was chaos. The papacy had become a battlefield for competing factions, each vying for control of the church. Cesare, who had been groomed to carry on his father's legacy, was now left without the resources to protect his territorial gains. His political maneuvering, once so effective, could no longer shield him from the mounting opposition. The alliances he had made with foreign powers, including his involvement with King Louis XII of France, began to unravel as his military ventures in Italy faltered. Cesare's ambition, which had once seemed unstoppable, now proved to be his undoing. By 1504, Cesare was in retreat. Stripped of his papal titles and unable to secure his position in Italy, he was forced to flee to Spain, where he attempted to seek support from the Spanish monarchy. However, even this alliance proved to be short-lived. In 1507, Cesare Borgia died as a mercenary in the service of the Spanish king, far from the heights of power he had once enjoyed. His death, though tragic, marked the end of the Borgia family's direct involvement in the political and military affairs of Italy. Meanwhile, Lucrezia Borgia, despite her family's scandals, managed to survive. After Alexander VI's death, she was married to Alfonso of Aragon, a marriage that would later end in tragedy when Alfonso was murdered, possibly on the orders of Cesare, to eliminate a rival. Lucrezia's later marriages would serve to secure her political power, but the damage to her reputation was lasting. Though she eventually became the Duchess of Ferrara and was rehabilitated in historical accounts, she could never entirely escape the shadow of her family's infamous name. The Borgias legacy, steeped in scandal and corruption, would haunt her throughout her life. The final blow to the Borgia family's political power came when the papacy itself moved on. After the death of Alexander VI, the Vatican began to distance itself from the scandalous practices that had marked his reign. The new popes who succeeded Alexander VI, including Pope Julius II, were determined to restore the dignity and moral authority of the papacy. Julius II, in particular, made a point of moving into new apartments that were not tainted by the memory of the Borgia family's excesses. He commissioned Raphael to decorate the new papal rooms, creating a visual break from the debauchery that had once defined the Borgia residence. While the papacy sought to recover from the moral and political fallout of the Borgia years, the damage to the church's reputation could not be undone. The excesses and corruption of the Borgia papacy had permanently altered the way in which the Catholic Church was viewed, both in Rome and throughout Europe. The widespread awareness of the Borgias' behavior would contribute to the growing calls for reform within the Church, eventually leading to the Protestant Reformation. In the years that followed, the Borgia family's name became synonymous with scandal, vice, and corruption. While the political fortunes of the Borgias faded, their legacy endured in the cultural imagination. They became the subject of numerous historical accounts, novels, and works of art, each emphasizing the family's depravity and ambition. The Church, too, was forced to confront the reality of its moral failings, and the Counter-Reformation, sparked by the Protestant revolt, sought to reassert the moral authority of the papacy. Though the echoes of the Borgia years would continue to resonate in the conscience of Europe, though the Borgias had fallen from power, the legacy of their reign would not be so easily forgotten. The Vatican's dark history under Pope Alexander VI served as both a cautionary tale and a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power. In many ways, the Borgia papacy was a reflection of the broader tensions within Renaissance Italy. The struggle between secular and religious power, the pursuit of wealth and political dominance, and the growing realization that the institutions that had once been seen as unassailable were now vulnerable to corruption. For Rome, the fall of the Borgias marked the end of an era. The Vatican, once a center of opulence and excess, would never again be the same. The papacy would go on, but its moral credibility had been forever compromised. The sacred and the profane, once so intertwined under the Borgia reign, would be kept at arm's length in future papacies, as the Church sought to rebuild and restore its reputation. Yet, for the Borgias, their downfall was a long time coming. Their ambition, their insatiable thirst for power, and their willingness to abandon moral and spiritual values in pursuit of dominance ultimately led to their ruin. The family that had once seemed invincible was brought low, their name forever tied to one of the most scandalous and corrupt periods in the history of the Catholic Church. The fall of the Borgia family did not mark the end of their impact on history. In fact, their infamous reign would echo through the centuries, influencing not only the Catholic Church, but the broader narrative of Renaissance, Italy, and beyond. The scandalous events surrounding Alexander VI and his children, particularly their moral decay and political manipulations, provided ammunition for both religious reformers and secular critics, who saw in the Borgias the embodiment of everything that was wrong with the Church and the political systems of their time. Though the Borgia family's political influence was extinguished with the death of Cesare and the eventual demise of Alexander VI's power, their name lived on in both legend and history. The actions of Alexander VI, Cesare, and Lucrezia became a potent symbol of the dangers of unchecked power and the moral cost of ambition. For centuries, their story would be retold in countless works of art, literature, and history, each portrayal adding layers to the already complex legacy of the Borgias. The family's rise to power, their extravagance, and their eventual downfall served as a cautionary tale of how the pursuit of power can corrupt even the most sacred of institutions. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Borgia family lies in the scandal of the Banquet of Chestnuts. The event itself, with its debauchery and depravity, became a symbol of the collapse of the moral authority of the papacy. In the eyes of many, it represented the point at which the sacred and the profane ceased to be distinguishable, when the very institution that was meant to lead the faithful had become consumed by the same vices it was supposed to condemn. The Banquet of Chestnuts did not just scandalize Rome, it shocked the world, exposing the corruption at the heart of the papacy and contributing to the growing calls for reform that would ultimately lead to the Protestant Reformation. In the years following the scandal, the Borgia family's name would be linked to the growing movement for religious reform, particularly as critics of the Church sought to point to the moral failures of the papacy as evidence of the need for change. Reformers like Martin Luther, whose criticisms of the Catholic Church would lead to the Protestant Reformation, seized upon the Borgia scandal as proof of the papacy's corruption. The event was a potent symbol for those who argued that the Church had lost its way and that a new path free from the corruption of Rome was necessary. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church, under new leadership, sought to recover from the damage caused by the Borgia papacy. The papacy of Julius II, which followed Alexander VI, marked a clear break from the excesses of the Borgia reign. Julius II moved the papacy away from the moral debauchery of the Borgias, focusing instead on rebuilding the church's authority and its relationship with the faithful. His reign saw the commissioning of some of the most iconic works of the Renaissance, including the Sistine Chapel ceiling painted by Michelangelo, an attempt to restore the Vatican's prestige through cultural achievement rather than political manipulation. Despite these efforts at reform, the legacy of the Borgias could not be so easily erased. The Vatican's history was permanently marred by the scandals that had defined the Borgia era, and the echoes of their reign would continue to reverberate through the centuries. Even as the Church moved forward, its past remained an uncomfortable reminder of the temptations and excesses that had once corrupted its highest offices. In the centuries following the Borgia papacy, their story continued to captivate the imagination. Novels, plays, films, and television series, such as the popular Borgia series, depicted the family's rise to power and their moral decline. These portrayals, often fictionalized and sensationalized, have ensured that the Borgia name remains synonymous with corruption, intrigue, and scandal. The moral lessons drawn from their reign are as relevant today as they were in the 16th century, reminding us of the dangers of unchecked power and the consequences of abandoning integrity in the pursuit of ambition. The legacy of the Borgias also lives on in the Vatican's own history. The scandals of the late 15th and early 16th centuries forced the Catholic Church to confront its own corruption. While the events surrounding Alexander VI and his family did not single-handedly cause the Protestant Reformation, they contributed to a broader atmosphere of disillusionment with the Church's leadership. The Borgia papacy, in all its excess and moral failing, became a symbol of the need for reform, an idea that would eventually take shape in the Counter-Reformation, a movement aimed at purging the Church of its abuses and restoring its credibility. The Vatican's efforts to reform, following the Borgia years, were not limited to spiritual matters. They also focused on the physical structure of the Vatican itself. After Julius II became Pope, he sought to distance the papacy from the scandals of his predecessors by commissioning grand building projects, including the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica and the renovation of the papal apartments. The construction of these monuments was, in part, an attempt to restore the dignity and moral authority of the papacy, creating physical spaces that would embody the sanctity and reverence that had been lost during the Borgia era. Yet, for all the Vatican's attempts to move past the Borgia legacy, the historical shadow of their rule remains. The Banquet of Chestnuts is not just a footnote in the history of the papacy. It is a symbol of everything that went wrong with the Church during the Renaissance. It stands as a stark reminder of how power, when unchecked and unaccountable, can lead to the moral decay of even the most sacred institutions. The Borgia papacy, and particularly the events surrounding the Banquet of Chestnuts, forced the Catholic Church to reckon with its own corruption and excess. Though the Church did eventually recover, its reputation was permanently altered by the actions of Alexander VI and his family. The Borgia story is one of ambition, power, and ultimately, ruin. But it is also a story of how one family's pursuit of power can alter the course of history, leaving a legacy that transcends time. The Borgias are remembered not just for their political achievements, but for their moral failings, their ruthlessness, and their unapologetic indulgence in the very vices they were meant to condemn. And in the end, perhaps that is the true legacy of the Borgia family, a warning about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the consequences of moral decay, not just for individuals, but for entire institutions.